Welcome to Authors Revealed. I'm Becky Anderson. We are thrilled. We have New York Times best-selling author and Pulitzer Prize winner, Anna Quindlen, and her new novel, Miller's Valley. Well, Anna, welcome back to Anderson's in Naperville.
Thanks, Becky.
And congrats on Miller's Valley. We've had a bunch of our booksellers already read it, and they absolutely adored it. This book is, you know, it's so interesting. I think some people are calling it sort of that big American book in a way, because it is the story of a family, but it's also a story that changes through the decades, and you see a girl coming of age, but it's also about what happens to some of our small towns. It's got so much to it.
Oh, thanks.
But we've loved it. So I just want to say congrats, because it's only been out in the world actually for about a week. So what are you hearing from your readers and maybe people who are new to your novels?
I tend to hear from people who have read on a continuum, you know, and compare and contrast and everything. But people do seem to be responding to this really powerfully. I think a lot of it has to do with Mimi Miller. I know she's not actually a real person, but she's very real to me, and I hope to readers. She's the protagonist of this novel. It's a first-person novel, which means it's told in her voice, and she has just a particular way of looking at the world, a very, very straight-ahead, pragmatic, plain-spoken way of looking at the world that I think people find kind of irresistible.
Yeah, and I loved her character because she doesn't have any of that vanity. I mean, she's not, you know, it's not all about her. She's sort of, you get such a great view of what's happening in her life, but also from sort of the way she started as a sheltered sort of child as at 10, growing up in this town, but seeing as she grows. And then there's sort of a gap as you jump to the end. And I don't want to do too many spoilers on this book because there are some of that. But where did the seeds for this book start to go, and for the character of Mimi? And is Mimi, of course, we always ask, part you or part somebody that you know?
Mimi isn't based on anyone I know, and certainly isn't based on me. She's quite different from me, although, you know, obviously writers put little bits and pieces of themselves in every character, in everything they do in every novel. But there's a kind of girl that I've always been interested in and taken by. She's a watcher. You know, certain of us are actors, you know, really out there down in the weeds, talking, getting involved. Mimi's a different type. She's somebody who sits back and watches what's going on around her in a way that I think really makes her an incredible observer of the human condition.
Right. And she's so smart. She's such a smart girl.
She's smart, but she's not show-offy smart.
Right, exactly.
She's smart. Well, first of all, unlike me, she's a math and science girl. She distrusts fiction and poetry because at some level it's not real. She likes those real things. Yeah. And I was really intrigued by writing a character like that, too.
Yeah. She's a STEM girl before her time.
Exactly.
Yeah. So where did the seeds start to grow? Because, you know, we're talking about a valley and a family who's been in this area farming for 200 years, and now the government says there could be eminent domain unless, you know, you sell out your property and we relocate you because this is going to become a huge reservoir. So it's a real, what's happening to 6,400 acres approximately that's going to become, it's going to be flooded. So I mean, it's such an interesting premise. And because it's all about place, you know, and home and what those types of things mean. But where did you get the seed for that to base it on what's going to happen in Miller's Valley to begin with?
Well, I was always intrigued by a story of a place called the Tox Island Dam, which was proposed for the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania on the Delaware River. Unfortunately for the people who were proposing the dam, there were actually people living on Tox Island, and they managed to get rid of all of them by either buying them out or by eminent domain. And then they decided not to build the dam. And those houses sort of fell into ruins. There were squatters living there for years. And I read about this probably 20, 25 years ago, and I was just intrigued by that idea of, first of all, that somebody could take your home from you, which seemed just incredible to me. And second of all, by that notion of changing the topography to eliminate the people for, to some extent, what was called the greater good. Now, I didn't exactly translate that into this, but it's always been a situation, and at some level a metaphor that's been in the back of my mind. And so this is a book where I finally brought it to fruition.
And drowned towns, calling them
Well,
drowned
now
towns.
that's the only thing in the book that's actually literal.
Right.
I never do any research for my novels. It's been a great relief after all those years as a reporter and a columnist not to actually have to know things to have it be my world and welcome to it. But I was looking through some pictures to try to figure out what dams looked like, and I came upon this term of art, that something was called a drowned town. And I must say, as a wordsmith, I didn't jump out of my chair, but I wanted to, because it's such a beautiful term, and I immediately thought, well, that one's going right in the book.
Right. You know, it's so interesting. You use this sort of as a focus of what's happening for this family in this place. But, you know, with all the drought that's been happening in certain parts of our country, you know, some of those towns that were similar to Miller's Valley, were covered up with water, have now emerged, which is so interesting that it's always there, but now you'll see buildings and things appearing out of the water because of all the serious drought.
But one of the great things about writing a novel is when people convince themselves that it's so real, that they know the situation or they know the people. And when I was in California recently talking about the book, person after person came up to me and said, oh, I know the town where this happened. You based it on, and then they'd give me a name and I'd say, I'm sorry, I've never been there or heard of it. No, but that, and I think people feel a little silly after the fact about doing that, but I am thrilled by that because it means that it seems so real to them that they're convinced it must be based in a real place.
Right. Well, they take a little bit of that ownership that they've heard of this or they know this. And
exactly.
Sort of thing. Yeah. So Mimi, you know, she's 10 or 11, I think, you know, and all this, and there are a lot of changes happening because you based this novel in the 60s. So she was probably born in the late 50s or something, somewhere in the mid-50s. And knowing the world is changing, everything's changing in this country in the 60s. So her DNA, what did the time period have to do with Mimi herself and her family?
Well, it is a period when everything changes, and especially for people, I mean, they're a farming family. Is there anything that became less part of the American scene than the small family farm during the 70s and 80s? And also, she's a young girl who's looking around thinking, what kind of future can I possibly have? Her mother's a nurse. She has good teachers that she likes, so she thinks nurse or teacher. That's probably one or the other. And suddenly the world begins to open up for young women in the United States, and she's able to have different opportunities and make different choices for herself.
Right. And the women, you talk about her mom, Miriam, you know, she's kind of a woman that some people turn to, but she's a nurse, but she's sort of refusing to give up about where they have to move their home, but then eventually does give in to that. But she's a mother who takes care of her children. She raises them well. She does her job, but she does it without sentiment. You know,
right.
She's an interesting woman. And then also Mimi's Aunt Ruth, becomes kind of reclusive. But then we, and without spoilers, we don't want to tell about secrets that are revealed and everything. So we'll have to kind of skirt around those issues. But what interesting women in her life, though.
But I think the reader has the same experience that most of us have had in our lives, which is when we're children, we think we know the people around us, and we think we know them because we think they're simple, straightforward. My dad is this kind of guy. My mom is this kind of woman. By the time we get to be teenagers, we think that they know them because everything we see course, we're so egocentric that everything we see is what really exists. And it isn't until we get to be older that we realize that perhaps one of the great mysteries of our lives is who our parents really are.
You know, Miller's Valley itself, you know, this town in Pennsylvania, is a character in this book, obviously. And you have detailed it so well in the description of, you know, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're, you know, tasting and feeling, all those things that make a place. And how much does place or home play in all of our lives? When you think of, you know, I grew up in a town where I'm a fifth generation, you know, and my kids are 6, and we've been in a family business for a really long time, and my parents still live in the same house my great-great-grandfather built. So place is huge to us. And I think for this family, it's the same way.
Well, but I think that you've hit on something really interesting. Place is huge for you because you're in the same place.
Yeah.
You're with the same people. Place is just as huge if you've moved, if the place where you lived feels completely different, if you're scattered, if you've roamed far from home, which so many Americans do now. But I think for most people, the place where you grew up is the place that you can best describe. I mean, I can still recite the address of the house where I grew up, even though I haven't lived there in 50 years. I can still tell you the telephone number. I know exactly when you get off the trolley car at the station, how to walk from that trolley first to my school, then to my house. And again, it's been 50 years, but I think things imprint on you when you're young in a way that they don't when you're older.
Yeah. And I know Mimi she says something in the book. She says home can be a place where it's just as easy to feel lost as it is to feel contented.
Well, but you know, that's true.
But that's true. But
Yeah.
that's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she really comes of age in this story, and there's a sort of a leap from an earlier part of the book to now everybody's, you know, some of the characters are now in middle age, but we sort of see of what has become to her and her family. So in knowing how brave she is, she just really is just such a great character. How did you decide to do that part? And did you outline to have this gap in the story to let it jump to see where everyone ends up in a way? Or how did you decide to do that as part of the story?
I think I knew that from the very beginning. Okay. I almost always know how a book is going to begin and how it's going to end. It's the middle that is challenging for me. And with this book, one of the departures from this novel for me is that it does take place over a much longer period of time. I've tended to write novels that take place at a discrete, a moment of great flux, or, you know, every last one takes place only during the period of a year. Still Life with Breadcrumbs, the same. I like that idea of having the time period in my hand so that I can roam far and away with the characters. But in this case, I really felt that if I wanted to illustrate how life had changed for women during the course of a certain period in American history, I really had to start with almost nothing and move to opportunity, and that required that broad span. But I think sometimes memory works in snippets like this, and they're never the snippets you think they're going to be. It's never like, oh, I remember the day of my 18th birthday, or oh, I remember the day when I graduated from college. It's always some nonsense day when you fell in the creek and put a big gash in your knee, or the night that you got caught skinny dipping in a backyard pool at midnight, or something of that sort. And that's more of what I was trying to capture in the book. Those moments that are so vivid and tell you so much about yourself, and yet aren't really signal moments as we normally think of them.
Right. And it's so interesting talking about families. One person, and this is from Mimi's perspective, but one person can see something that's happened so differently than another person, and experiencing the same event, the same moment. It's so interesting how that happens.
Yeah, but the interesting thing about a first-person novel, and sometimes you can feel a little hamstrung by it, but ultimately with a book like this, which is to some extent about family secrets, it works, is I can only know as much as Mimi knows. So people have said to me about certain revelations at the end of the book, oh, you left that ambiguous. And I say, no, I didn't leave it ambiguous. I only know as much about it as Mimi knows about it, and whether because of desire or lack of information, Mimi doesn't know everything there is to know.
Right. So knowing your family story and losing your mom when you were 19 and she was only 41 at the time, and then you became, with some of your dad's help, but you're the oldest of 5 kids. And how did all those experiences influence your life as a writer and your career that you eventually chose, do you think?
It made me a better person, and I think the more empathetic you are, the better a novelist you are. Right. I mean, fiction writing requires you to live in someone else's skin, and if you don't basically have deep, deep relations to other humans, I don't know how you would do that.
Right. And as readers, we know what fiction reading can do, no matter what age you are, in building empathy, which is so important.
Building empathy, but also building self-knowledge. I mean, I think the legerdemain of reading novels is that you both experience what it's like to be someone else, but with the best books, you experience what it's like to be yourself more deeply and fully.
Right.
And that's such an incredible hat trick, and it's why I love reading so much. I was going to say writing, but that's not true. I don't love writing so much. I love reading so much. I mean, reading, bar none, is my single favorite activity.
Yeah, I think it's pretty close for me too. So as a reader and who writes, and you wrote, a lot of columns and you did a lot of nonfiction as a street reporter and all that. What was it like to switch to writing fiction? Was that in a way free in a way, or what was that experience compared to all the things you had written for in writing that first novel?
I actually didn't switch from nonfiction to fiction. I switched from fiction to nonfiction. Back to fiction.
Okay.
I was an English major with a creative writing concentration in college, and I spent a lot of time working on writing fiction, and that really was always my goal, but I wanted to make a living. Okay. And I made a living in the newspaper business, and I was incredibly lucky enough to do so because it's just the best job ever.
So, being that street reporter and that whole experience, what did that bring to your writing as a fiction writer or a novelist?
It taught me to recognize the telling detail, which can communicate so much in a little bit of space. It taught me how real people talked by writing down their words verbatim in my notebooks. It taught me to write tight. I think that's really, really important. A lot of the books I read now, I think this book would be first rate if it was 50 pages shorter. I think writing tight is really. I'm not militating against the 600 or 700 page novels. Some of them are my faves, if they require 600 or 700 pages. But sometimes I read a book that's 500 pages long when the same story could have been told in 300. And working in a newsroom teaches you to write even when you don't feel like writing.
Right.
And that's invaluable for somebody who's going to be sitting alone on the top floor of their house trying to pound it out every day.
Right. So Dickens, one of your favorite authors, and thinking about his writing, what did you think about his writing? I mean, with a Dickensian,
it's
viewpoint.
perfect.
Okay, so there.
No, I mean, first of all, Dickens needs all of those pages. Right. People always say Dickens novels are so long because he serialized them, and they had to be a certain length to go into the serial form, and then they were produced in book form. But the truth is, he covers so much in his books that he really does need all those pages. And he does this fantastic thing, which is he combines a great story about real characters with a social conscience. So every one of the novels has some theme outside of of simply the plot of the novel. You know, for example, Bleak House, about the legal system. And I always loved how he was able to do that, and I hope to try to do it in my novels as well.
I think you're doing a pretty good job. I think he would be proud. So many women feel that with all the columns you wrote and a lot of your nonfiction books that you've written, and even your fiction, what we get out of reading those books, is that they don't feel alone, that they have someone else who understands them, that they can feel like they can relate to, or maybe that there's something in there that is sort of confirming what they're thinking and they're feeling. Do you ever get, I'm sure you hear a lot of people, because I miss reading your columns in Newsweek, and I know you haven't been doing those for, what, 5 or 6 years, I can't remember, but I would love turning to the back of those, and if it was George Orwell, I would put it down and go, I got the wrong week, you know. But people, do you hear that a lot from women missing you writing those columns, but they can still get so much out of what else you're writing?
Well, you know, it's funny. I now have a whole group of readers who never knew me that way, who only think of me as a novelist. And then I still have a whole group of readers from the columns who are only beginning to understand that I write novels. And then luckily I have a whole group who like both.
Like both. So they're
but you know, when people say we miss you, I mean, what could be nicer than that? It's fantastic.
Sure.
And somebody said to me the other night, you know, what are your fans like? And I was like, they're just like me. They're the nicest people imaginable, and they always wind up befriending one another in the lines for signings.
Yeah.
And that's just nothing but a great feeling.
That is for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can so see that. I can so see that. So I bet you're glad you're not doing those daily columns or anything with what's going on out in the world in many aspects right now.
Really glad.
I bet you're really glad.
I'm really glad.
Yeah. So Anna, what is your first recollection of wanting to be a writer? How old were you? And do you remember that first piece that you go, look what I wrote, you know, kind of thing, when you were a child?
It didn't quite happen that way. It happened in a different magical way that I think is really important to mention and to honor. I'm a writer because of teachers. Teachers, when you're growing up, are the second most important adults in your life after your parents. And over again, teachers would say to me, this is really good. You really write well. I'm giving you an A on this. You know, I remember writing a whole series of really junky little poems, but I was in 4th grade, and my teacher was very complimentary. And when your teachers tell you over and over again that you're good at something, it's something you continue doing, and that's exactly how it happened.
Okay.
I mean, I think if people were paid what their work deserves, teachers would be among the highest paid people in America.
Oh, yeah, well, they should be, instead of what we pay for, you know, coaches of major basketball or football or whatever that is. So your kids, I know your son Chris is writes, and he's been to Naperville, and he's done our Naperville Reads program. So what do you feel about them getting into the writing field, and what kind of advice do you give to Chris now that he's
no advice.
Okay,
No.
All right,
We're kind of, all 3 of my children write. All 3 of them write very well, because each one of them has an idiosyncratic voice, and they've learned to honor that voice, which is, I think, because we honor it, which is really important, because if you've got the voice, you're more than halfway there. And I think one of the reasons why they've been able to do this is because it seems really workaday impossible to them. I mean, you know, they would watch as the woman in their kitchen picked up a mug of coffee and trudged upstairs and sat up there for 2 hours and came down and grumbled and went back upstairs. I think they're probably like plumbers' kids who understand how to take a toilet apart and put it back together again. This seems really possible and demystified to them in a way that's nothing but good.
Yeah, that's true. So I heard you write. You've written on this topic, but also spoken on this in interviews and stuff like that about a time you reached in your life when, I don't know how many years ago, but always thinking before that time that I'm never good enough, and in many different ways. And I think that speaks to a lot of us as women, where we don't think we're good enough. Whether I'm not a good enough parent, I'm not a good enough, I don't do well enough in my job, I don't look good enough. All those different things where we try and tear ourselves down. And you reached a point in your life where you said, that's enough. And what was it?
I'm fine.
Yes, well, that's what how do you reach
I'm
that
fine.
point? Because I think a lot of us feel that way. And just wondering, what was that point that changed it for you? The saying that, I've got, my kids are great, what I've done with my career, all those types of things.
Well, one story stuck in my mind that I came back to over and over again as I began to get older. I was pregnant with Quinn, so I guess I was 30, and they asked me to become the deputy metropolitan editor of the paper, which would have made me the highest ranking woman at the paper. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and I said, well, of course I can't take it. I've never been an editor, and all of a sudden I'm the number 2 person on the Metro desk, with the assumption being that I'll become the number 1 person. I mean, I can't take it. I mean, and he said to me, Anna, you're comparing yourself to the perfect person for this job. I want you to now compare yourself to the person who will get the job if you pass on it. And I went, oh, I can do this job. I mean, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And as time went by, over time, I thought, I'm no longer going to compare myself to some ideal. I'm going to compare myself to the real. And the real deal is that I have work I really like and that people seem to appreciate. I've been married to the same person for almost 40 years. I look okay in clothes. My kids are great. I mean, I'm not gonna, and part of it is the hypocrisy factor. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've made a life out of trying to say to other women, let's be friends. Let's acknowledge that we're all doing the best we can. How can I say that to other women and not say it myself? I remember one day when I was on the phone with my closest friend, who I talked to every morning on the phone, and I got off and Maria was passing through and she made some comment about, I don't know, somebody in her class or something, and I said, come on, no gossip. And she turned on me and said, you should talk, because she'd been listening to me on the phone. So you gotta be the best version of yourself for your daughter, if for no other reason.
Yeah. So I want to know, I know you've only done a couple of picture books, and I love the book, The Tree That Came to Stay, and I've adopted that. We do the same thing by Saving the Needles. Have you thought about doing another picture book?
I'll probably do another book for children. The only reason I did 2 books for children is because I had children. Right. And I got them involved. When we were going through the editing process, when we were trying to decide on the illustrator, all 3 kids were involved. So it was something professional to do with them. I think I will probably do the same thing with grandchildren.
Okay, good. Well, we'll look forward to that. So what's on your writing desk right now? Anything you're working on? Because now that this is just out in the world, I'm probably pushing you to give us a little.
No, I'm working on a new novel. Okay. I always start, before book tour, I always start the next novel, just so I feel like, the motor's still running.
Yeah. So can you give us a little idea, or are you keeping that under wraps?
It's called Alternate Side. It's set in New York City, and it's at least partly about income inequality.
Okay. And with Mimi and her voice in this book, what do you hope people will take away from her story and the way she tells it?
I hope they take themselves away from, it's what I always hope for novels. I hope someone reads it, lives in the world in the novel, and emerges feeling as though they understand themselves better.
Yeah. So Anna, thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me, and congratulations on Miller's Valley. We absolutely love it.
Thanks, Becky.
What an incredible conversation with Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times best-selling author Anna Quindlen and her new novel. It's called Miller's Valley. Thanks for joining me on Authors Revealed.